Today we're going to talk about what it's like for international lawyers moving to London, and what do you think is the biggest draw for international lawyers specifically moving to London?
Well, it certainly depends on the jurisdiction they're moving from. Very generally speaking, the attraction to London is it's a much more developed legal market, second only to New York in the world. The salaries are higher than every other jurisdiction, and the quality of the work, it's predominantly cross-border, and it's a hub for private equity. So there's also outside of work, London is a draw culturally. It does depend. Those coming from Asian jurisdictions, there is the opportunity to join Magic Circle in US firms and receive the compensation that you would expect, but particularly those from Australia and New Zealand, historically and still want to work in a more dynamic legal market. And really the compensation is, I would say, a leading attraction.
For me, one of the biggest trajectories an Australian lawyer had was do a couple of years in Sydney, Melbourne, Perth to Brisbane, and then get to the UK, London specifically, to try and build on that career, because the deal size and the deal value is on so much more multiples than what you would have in the Australian or New Zealand market. So once, let's say, an Australian or New Zealand lawyer has made the move to London specifically, what do you think a move to London can do to someone's career trajectory?
The quality and sophistication of the transaction they work on, if they were to return back to their jurisdiction, be it Australia, New Zealand, would certainly fare them well. We are also have been for the last year, 18 months, maybe 2 years, been in a slightly more difficult market in London for those lawyers who want to move from another jurisdiction. So therefore, those who are in London already benefit from the London experience. If you're minded to stay in London, build your career here permanently towards making partner, the fact you already have London experience is key in the current market. That is changing. I think the teams in London are more siloed than perhaps other jurisdictions. So you would have a broader role perhaps from the market you've moved from, and in London you may find yourself more specialised, which can develop that skill set further, which some people find very attractive. So I suppose that's a benefit as well. Perhaps could become more of an expert in a particular practice area.
And then if you look at London compared to other legal markets, it- what are the key differentiators? And what I mean by that is let's just look at New York specifically. Can you give me a breakdown of the law firms? If I'm a lawyer looking to make a move in, what should I know? And what will be the key differences between the types of law firms you could be working
Yeah.
at?
So I think very interestingly now, I mean, the US firms in London are here permanently, and they're taking an ever larger slice of the UK firms' pie. So if you were to look at the landscape of law firms in the city now, 25 out of the top 50 would be American law firms. And that's not just those what would used to be considered perhaps the elite of New York. It's those who may even have a mid-market focus. It would help to understand that there are the US firms, the leading international UK firms, namely the Magic Circle and the Silver Circle, and the rest of the global firms. The term US firm isn't really fitting anymore. It used to mean New York firms. I think there are US firms over here competing with obviously the Magic Circle, but the Silver Circle, the international mid tier, and below that. So it's a very diverse law firm landscape. Really, the way to look at the London market is to understand which firms are focusing on the size of transaction and the value. So at the very top end, it will be the Magic Circle and the leading US firms. And then there's a huge mid market. And then there's a smaller deal value where you would have US firms, international UK firms, and sort of single office city firms competing for that. So it's actually in flux. It's always evolving, the London legal landscape. But I think it's helpful to think of it like that at the moment.
Yeah, and I think, for what it's worth, you have the London legal market is so dynamic that the role of a recruiter it's such a big part of an international lawyer's move, because that breakdown of law firm or specific roles within those law firms or specific partners, like, obviously they're not in that market that they're working in. So I think making a move internationally, my advice is always to have your eyes wide open as it relates to what that move looks like or the type of firm that you could be working at, because it's not all about brand or image in a specific location. Because to your point, the New York firms, the US firms are changing all the time. You mentioned that the last couple of years have been difficult for Australian and New Zealand lawyers specifically making a move to London. What do you reckon that is? And what do you expect over the next 12 months?
Yeah. So I think it's changed this year. There was a time, perhaps 4 or 5 years ago and beyond, where an Australian lawyer or a lawyer from New Zealand from a top tier firm would be seen almost in the same bracket as a someone who's already in the city. In the post-COVID boom, there were so many associates onboarded across all firms, really, that when the market shifted and that went away, associate teams were bloated, sort of towards in the middle of 2023, say, and then as the market rebounded and the recruitment market was such that firms wanted domestic candidates, those who were UK trained, and there wasn't enough opportunity to look outside of that bracket of candidate, and so therefore it was much more difficult for international lawyers to get a look in, and that slowly shifted, and we are in a place now where if you are in one of those core practice areas, namely leverage finance, private equity M&A, fund finance, importantly now, and private credit, there's a really buoyant recruitment market for it. There are some practice areas where it's still very difficult. I think disputes is a very difficult practice area for people from in the London market to move into. So I think as the market slowed, there was no need to look internationally. As it has improved, that's changed. And I think as we look through to 2026, I think there is enough evidence to say that that trend will continue, where those lawyers who perhaps aren't in London or the UK will have more opportunity. But it is really practice area specific.
It comes down to supply and demand, doesn't it? Really, at the end of the
It
day,
does.
if you're a law firm and you have an oversupply of local candidates to choose from when you're looking to recruit, of course you're going to choose someone who's got the local experience, who can plug and play to a certain degree, as opposed to having to look after someone's visa, flights, relocation, all the risks that are associated with that.
Yep.
And so that's something that you need to bear in mind, I believe, as an international lawyer. It's not about your actual skill set; it's more about that time, the timing in which you're looking to make a move. So, when is the right time for an Australian or a New Zealand lawyer to make the move, in your opinion, to give them the best chance of success in securing a role?
I would say there's two sides to it. There's when the firms are looking,
Mhm.
when they are advertising for positions and they are open to candidates from outside the jurisdiction. That is the best time. People who are considering moving their lives across the world have other considerations taken into account. They have their own timeline. I think it is pertinent to say that if you aren't trained in London or the UK, where you do a 2-year training contract, if you're coming from another jurisdiction, you'll typically be discounted your years of experience to bring you in line with UK associates. And therefore, you perhaps will need to be more senior and have more years under your belt than someone who you may be considered where you are. A mid-level who has 2-3 years experience will be considered a junior in London, typically. So therefore, the timing has to be, you have to be at the right point in your career. If you try when you're too junior, you are likely, the caveat being, of course, this is not true in every situation, but you could have a series of introductions made for you across the market and hear nothing, and then you are left to wait 6 months, a year before you're more experienced and try again. And at that point where you try again, you've already been seen by a lot of places, and sometimes it doesn't matter, but sometimes it can be to your detriment. So waiting until you are an experienced lawyer with at least I would say 2 to 3 years of qualified experience where you are under your belt before you thinking about making the move. But the most important advice I would suggest is to do it when there are firms who you'd be interested in recruiting. If you're approached by a recruiter because there is a position for which they feel you're suitable, you're best to take advantage of that.
I think it's important for people to understand, people listening into the podcast, around how law firms treat ownership as it relates to applications. So usually when you make an application, either through a recruiter or by yourself, there's a 6-month ownership on that application. And then equally, when you're making a move internationally, there is an element of upskilling involved. So, when firms do look at you with a 2-year discount, it's almost like you're taking one step backwards to make 2 steps forwards. So coming at it and looking at it from, all right, the timing perspective is, if I make this application and the market isn't there for it, then I might have to wait at least 6 months to make another application. And then on the other side is when a firm comes back to me after an interview process and tells me that we actually see you as a 1 PQE or a 2 PQE, which comes with a considerable discount, take their word for it because they want to set you up for success. Bringing you across the other side of the world is not in their best interest to set you up for failure. So I think those two are important considerations. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, you have to accept that, I think. And it is to bring you in line with where they feel you would fit in with their own bank of associates. And on that basis, you should take that as the best opportunity for you.
People that from the dozens and dozens of associates we've placed over the years, they've always been very, very grateful for the advice we've given around, going in there, proving your worth, proving your skill set, and then after your first reviews, maybe it was fairly justified to make that discount. But if it isn't, then you have that honest conversation with some leverage behind you that you've absolutely smashed in your first year, and you should be either uplifted in your PQE or you sit where you are. So I think if you're looking to make a move and things haven't really gone well the first time around, second time, is there anything you can be doing in terms of upskilling? A big thing they look at in the US is maybe should I do an LLM? Or, if I'm in a practice area like disputes in Australia or New Zealand, but that doesn't really transfer well with a move. Like if a move to London or New York is your long-term career goal, when do you reckon you should be getting your ducks in a row as it relates to getting yourself ready with regards to an international move?
Well, I think that starts immediately. So if you want to move to London, for example, and work in a top tier international firm, then you need to be firstly working at a firm which those firms would consider applicants from. So you need to be working in one of the top firms in your market. If you are in an example where we talk about targeting the elite group of firms in London, it can be, although it's not impossible, it depends on the practice area. If you're at what may be considered a more mid-tier firm in your jurisdiction, it's in your interest to move to one of the top tier firms or where you can work on the most sophisticated work as soon as possible in order to gain that experience. Because what will count in your favor when making applications to be it London or New York is the quality of work that you're doing and showing that you've worked on deals that are as sophisticated as they can be and as large, and you've worked under the demands of those transactions. And the sooner you can get that, the better. And the longer you do it, the better in order to be considered for a move to London. So, and we have plenty of times in the past, as you alluded to, advise people that sometimes you have to take that slightly longer approach. The other factor is if you apply to London, if you've already applied and it hasn't got anywhere through, maybe you were too junior, weren't advised properly, or perhaps your profile isn't appropriate in that you weren't a firm that the firms you're targeting would consider appropriate. The recruiter who probably approached you and put you forward, or you approached, will have ownership, as you say, for 6 months. Sometimes it's a year. And sometimes it's easy to get caught up where it becomes a mess when you are waiting for the 6-month ownership period from one recruiter to end so you can make another application, because you can work on the assumption that that's okay. But really, you're just joining a group of lawyers in the market who are applying to the same firm at the same time when their 6 months ownership up. And the firm noticed that, and it going through another recruiter because the one that you made an original approach for can be to your detriment sometimes. So the best advice is to take advice as soon as possible. Query if someone it's in a recruiter's interest to have your CV with as many firms as possible. And sometimes that's not always in the individual's. In fact, in many cases, not always in the individual lawyer's best interest. So do qualify, do interview your recruiter, and make sure that the advice you're comfortable that what they're saying, the advice you're receiving, feels genuine. Because you have to have confidence in that recruiter in order to go and make those approaches for you, so you don't get caught up in this merry-go-round of applying every 6 months when it's not appropriate.
And I think about it's like timing is everything in life, but so are first impressions, in my opinion. And I think you're seeing growing practice areas now, like energy and renewables, and private credit. And if you're looking at those practice areas which haven't had a huge graduate intake, if I'm an international lawyer and I want to make a move overseas and I want to focus on renewables energy or private credit or one of those growing practice areas, what can I be doing to set myself up for success with regards to a move?
You have to gain exposure to that work where you are as best you can.
So it's not just a case of because it's a growing practice area. If I'm a corporate M&A associate, can I just go work in a corporate energy team in London?
It would be more difficult at the elite end of the London private practice market, any piece of recruitment is a competition. And we are incentivized. Our job is supposed to be introducing that firm to the perfect candidate. The perfect candidate will be doing that exact work, probably already in London and probably trained here with a competitor. So you have to go to every interview, every piece of recruitment with the mindset that that person does exist and is in there. So if you aren't that, it can be very difficult to be seen ahead of the crowd. So that situation can be difficult. If we move into a very busy M&A market, the M&A market is certainly improving, but in 2022 and 2021, it really was busy. I think those moves were happening. If you have the skill set of an M&A lawyer and you wanted to specialize or take an opportunity in a practice area which you don't necessarily have the experience in, it could happen. So market conditions really dictate that. I think there is capacity at the moment. If you are a banking and finance lawyer, there is so much activity in structured credit, fund finance at the moment, as traditional lenders at the banks aren't financing funds to alternative lenders, credit funds, is where a lot of the action is. And therefore, if you're a finance lawyer who wanted to move into that, I suspect that you could get traction, but you would have to be able to articulate that you really do understand what that practice area and why it's busy and what the role entails. So yeah, I think the answer is there is capacity for that, but more difficult.
Again, coming back to supply and demand, and I think, if you look at it, you raise a really interesting point. When you are making a move as an Australian or New Zealand lawyer, or any lawyer trying to break into London, you're not just competing with lawyers from London, but also from Scotland, from Ireland, also from the US, from Canada, from Hong Kong, from Singapore, Australia, New Zealand. So you got to understand that it's not just a case of making an application and getting called in. You have to show them something that they can't get themselves or they haven't got. And I think it's such an important part. And sometimes it's not just about, yeah, from a personal standpoint, I'm ready to make a move. You have to position yourself and get yourself ready by way of an overall package to set you up for success when you do eventually want to make those applications.
It's also helpful for people to understand that the real sweet spot for hiring associates in London is 3 to 5 PQE UK. So when you factor in, many firms will look to discount at least one. Sometimes it's a standard 2 years. You're looking at a 5th, 6th year Australian lawyer being in the sweet spot for where most of the action is. So understanding that's the case. And if your ambition is to move to London, if you can allow yourself a few more years, if you're in the appropriate firm, to get more and more experience, you'll only become a better candidate and be more straightforward. But quite often people have decided that's their ambition when they maybe have been a student, when they're training, and then once they have some experience, they want it to happen and they ask recruiters to go and do it for them. But at the most junior level, so UK NQ to 1 to 2, there is recruitment that happens there, but it's much more difficult.
If I'm an Australian lawyer, the market's not right for me to break into a US firm. Would you recommend me potentially joining another firm in the UK market to give me that local experience to eventually then get to my dream firm? Or is it a case that wait out your time in Australia, New Zealand, before eventually making the move?
I would suggest it's in your interest to get into London and get London experience. There are examples of top tier firms, some US firms, which many people want to target as their destination firm, who for certain practice areas will not recruit anyone who isn't already in London and gain London experience. It's not about becoming UK qualified or England and Wales qualified. It's not necessarily even about having been trained here. We have moved away from a market where that seemed to be top priority. Having London experience, I would say it is massively in your benefit to move to a top tier firm in London to gain that experience in order to qualify you to be considered for those leading firms at the very top of the market. Absolutely.
And then on the flip side, what are the common misconceptions you think are around US firms in London? So if you're making a move over here and someone presents you with a US firm, and what are the common pushbacks or the misconceptions you think are in the market?
From the lawyer themselves?
Yeah.
So I think the magic circle are still the leading firms in their practice areas. And there are exceptions to that with certain practice areas. So certainly in private equity, you could look at Latham, Kirkland, and what Paul Weiss is doing now. But they are not all the same. The US firm moniker really isn't helpful when understanding the different US firms in London, of which there are many. So there are firms where you can get paid more than you would do in the Magic Circle, but they aren't as dominant in the market as a Magic Circle team. So that you can have better quality work, and to a certain extent, better, certainly in most cases, better training and development at a Magic Circle firm or some of the Silver and International firm. So there's a misconception that because they pay more, that perhaps they are a better place to develop as a lawyer. Another misconception I would say is that all the hours are much more demanding than you could be working at a UK firm. There are examples where that is the case, but it's by no means across the board. I think as for a misconception about a Magic Circle team can be one of the most demanding places to work, in line with some of the New York firms. So people shouldn't have the misconception that if you're a corporate lawyer, if you go to a Magic Circle firm, is a step down somehow in hours and intensity of hours, because it really isn't. So there is a lot of misconception about what people from other jurisdictions consider to be the top tier here.
It's really interesting because obviously, if you can talk about in more detail around how the US firms were set up when they launched in the UK, they actually took a lot of key partners from Magic Circle firms, and then you're seeing
Oh,
now Magic Circle firms break into New York, taking a lot of big heavy hitters and deal makers from US firms. It's a really interesting
yeah.
strategy. You can give us more information
Yeah,
on.
well, I suppose the misconception would be that US firms in the UK are full of American lawyers. They 95% UK trained. The partners and those who run the offices were hired from UK firms, and now many have trained where they are. Most have nearly all have a training program for taking graduates and training their own lawyers. And so culturally there are differences, but they are still, to many, the people who are there are largely British and people who've come from common law jurisdictions. They are very different to the New York offices of the same firms.
Okay, just to wrap it up then, if there was one key piece of advice you would give to someone who is considering making an international move in 2026, what would that be?
Well, from my perspective as a recruiter, it would be at the right level, be in the right practice area, which is something related to doing deals. Work with one recruiter so it doesn't get too messy for the recruiter who may represent you. Go through a consultative process with that recruiter. Even though you may be very busy and you've decided to make this move, you should build a relationship with that recruiter. Allow that recruiter to ask all the questions they need answered. You should push back and ask as many questions you need answered to find someone you, as much as you can, trust, because that person needs your trust and really needs to go to market on your behalf, in the knowledge that they aren't competing with someone else. But for us at Sonder, for lawyers who are outside the jurisdiction, we're really focused on those core deals practice areas of M&A, finance, and funds, corporate tax. So if your ambition is to work at the types of firms we've been talking about, it helps me doing that work for sure.
And then one final question then. How you mentioned working with one recruiter and finding someone who offers that consultative approach, but also on the flip side, how beneficial is it to have someone who's got actual boots on the ground in that location?
Well, extremely important, because the recruitment and the people who partners at the firms in London, the recruitment teams, are working the same hours that the recruiter, the firm who has boots on the ground, are working. So it makes it a lot easier for that recruiter to get the work done. I think where the benefit we have at Sonder now is boots on the ground in all the major jurisdictions. So it may be that you develop a relationship with the recruiter who is in your market, which helps you in your working day communicate. You will also, perhaps if you're working with myself in London, I would have taken the time to develop the relationship with you so you can trust that. But I think it's essential, really. It's not impossible. It just makes it more difficult.
It's also coming from a relationship with the law firm, in terms of you've made multiple placements with a lot of the leading US and Magic Circle law firms in the UK. So with that, they trust you. When you send them a candidate, it's like, you know what, this is coming from John, this is coming from Sonder. I know they're going to be briefed, and I know that they're going to be what we're looking for, as opposed to this person in a different location doesn't really understand the brand, hasn't got that same credibility.
For the last 18 months, 2 years, it has been more difficult than perhaps in previous years to make an international move. Firms want to deal with recruiters they know and trust, and they don't need to deal with people they don't. So if you find yourself dealing with a recruiter who doesn't really have a strong relationship or isn't known to those firms, it can be to your detriment. And it's the firms are not in the position where they have to work with any recruiter who's introducing talent. We are not in that type of recruitment market, so it absolutely helps to have a recruiter who has strong relationships with the firms.
Just to wrap up, JT, I've loved this. You've added some really, really knowledgeable advice, and you've added a lot of value to our network.